composed in July of 2014, Differing Theories of Cognition in Plato, Aristotle and Maximus the Confessor, an investigation of the Meno, and the texts on love and theology in pre-Christian times. Plato and Aristotle gave two different accounts of learning. In Plato's Meno, Socrates posits a view of learning as a process of remembrance, while Aristotle's view is that the natures of things are embodied in the objects we sense in reality, and thus we can learn of an essence by taking in sensory information. The Meno is a Platonic dialogue primarily between Socrates and Meno, a member of an aristocratic Thessalian family. They eagerly debate how virtue is acquired, and unsuccessfully attempt to define what virtue is. The Meno begins with the positing of a definition of virtue by Meno. At 71, Meno attempts to define virtue by describing several instances of it. Socrates then guides Meno toward refining his definition of virtue by pointing out what it lacks. In this first instance, Socrates shows Meno's initial definition of virtue to lack a description of the characteristics essential to virtue. 72d. Socrates is trying to get Meno to find the common thread among his several examples of virtue. Meno then overcompensates by giving too narrow a definition of virtue in his second attempt at 73e. Socrates eagerly points this mistake out. A typical Platonic dialogue consists of Socrates debating fundamental assumptions with a single dialogist. Usually Socrates' interlocutor begins the dialogue with confidence in his knowledge of a particular field, only to end the dialogue unsure of his grasp of the rudiments of the given field. Socrates continually offers competing options throughout his dialogues, and often cuts off one option with his own explanation and further pursues the remaining choice. In these dialogues, Socrates forces his conversational guests to clarify their primary assumptions. Socrates implies through his obsession with refinement that the best way for us to go about seeking knowledge is through negative definition. Because we often do not know, at least initially, what are the positive features that compose an object, we are best suited to seek knowledge by first cataloging what we do not know or what a thing is not. Definition is an integral part of the Socratic method. Definition, in a Socratic sense, can be thought of as a laying down of boundaries for the purpose of enclosing the essence of a thing. In 75e of the Meno, Socrates explains what a definition is in reference to a discussion on color and shape. By this I mean that the answers must not only be true, but in terms admittedly known to the questioner. I too will try to speak in these terms. Do you call something the end? I mean such a thing as a limit or boundary, for all those are, I say, the same thing. In this passage Socrates explains how he prefers to proceed within a discussion, in a manner opposed to sophistical disputation. Although in many instances it appears that Socrates' fellow disputant has returned to the same definition as he began with, in fact they have discovered more false definitions and thus have begun erecting the boundaries around the given subject even if they still lack the ability to positively define it. Socrates persistently requests Meno to define virtue from the beginning. This key phrase is Socrates' orienting mechanism that forces Meno to focus on the heart of the topic at hand, the definition of virtue. This motif exemplifies Socrates' dogged concentration on first principles. Definitions are the building blocks of propositions and syllogisms, and eventually philosophical systems. Socrates realizes this and does not allow his dialogues to wander too far from these primary concerns in his attempt to show the necessary consequences of a given line of thought. In 81d, Socrates sets forth his account of recollection in the process of refuting the debater's argument, which says that a man cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know. Socrates believes that we can in fact search for knowledge because the soul is immortal, has been born often, and has seen all things here and in the underworld, and there is nothing which it has not learned. Socrates then concludes, as the whole of nature is a king, and the soul has learned everything, nothing prevents a man, after recalling one thing only, a process men call learning, discovering everything else for himself, if he is brave and does not tire of the search. For searching and learning are, as a whole, recollection. We view the liberal arts, the trivium and quadrivium as specific skill sets that refine faculties we already possess. In this sense we agree with Socrates. Plato's presentation of Socrates' theory of recollection holds up much more in reference to human skills than to the content of learning, specific facts. How can the learning of the details of a recent event be a recollection of a previously experienced knowledge if the content in question has only recently come into existence? Socrates' account of learning will only maintain in this instance if taken to refer to general principles that are repeated throughout history. While Plato's Socrates finds difficulty in apprehending something we do not know, he finds a way out with his doctrine of recollection. Aristotle on the other hand places more faith in his senses and is ready to accept knowledge gained through the senses without requiring a doctrine of recollection. In 97d and 8 of the Meno-Socrates compares true opinions to statues of Daedalus. Daedalus is known in Greek mythology for creating animated statues. Just like statues of Daedalus which do not remain unless tied down, true opinions must be anchored by knowledge of their causes, otherwise they escape a man's mind. In this way Socrates distinguishes knowledge from correct opinion. Knowledge is an understanding of causes. Aristotle too believes that true scientific knowledge is an understanding of causes. While Plato and Aristotle differ on fundamental cognitive assumptions, they simultaneously agree on a general definition of knowledge. In late antique Christian times, the foremost contribution to the philosophy of knowing was made by Maximus the Confessor. According to him, for every created being there is a logoi, or an underlying truth that links the created with their creator. Maximus resides more on the mystical side of philosophy than Aristotle or Plato. Maximus distinctly lays out the basic doctrine of the logoi, also known as the inner essences or inner principles in his philocolic texts on love and theology. The logoi are defining principles that are intrinsic to beings who are created by God, Philokalia II 115. They pre-existed in God, Philokalia II 138. The inner essence of a created being is not an explanation of its material composition derived in a mystical way. The inner essence of a created being is rather the knowledge of the being's spiritual purpose, which always concerns the created being's relationship to its creator, Philokalia II 116. What makes the logoi important is their relationship to God, Philokalia II 115. For Maximus the logoi also function as a force of conscience in man. Maximus describes how the Paraclete acts with our logoi to provide us with a discretionary faculty in regards to sin. He embraces in unity the spiritual knowledge of all created things, providentially permeating all things with his power, and vivifying their inner essences in accordance with their nature. In this way he makes men aware of things done sinfully against the law of nature, and renders them capable of choosing principles which are true and in conformity with nature. Philokalia II 180. We learn from this passage that Maximus believes the inner essences act as a moral sense in man by allowing them to be aware of the spiritual consequences of various behavioral choices. Philokalia II 180. The logoi also serve representative purposes in addition to serving functional ones. The logoi, in following the cue of most aspects of the Church, serve to represent various divine symbols along with their multiple functions. One mysterious symbol that Maximus explains is that God continually becomes man in the inner principles, Philokalia II 182. He couples this by revealing that God's soul has the qualities of the inner essences, and his body the virtues. This is a lofty truth that might imply that for Maximus, when a Christian practices the virtues he is somehow interacting with Christ's body. It might also imply that when the Orthodox Christian apprehends the logoi, he is also apprehending Christ's soul in some way. Finally, the logoi also represent the external forms of spiritual realities, Philokalia II 185. Thus far we have looked at the logoi in relation to God, but now we will investigate the purpose the logoi serve for Maximus in the inner life of a Christian. Maximus believes that God allows his chosen to contemplate the inner principles in order that they might be drawn in more fervent zeal to worship him. Maximus elucidates that we come to belief and faith in God through understanding His creation. Philokalia II 115. Maximus believes the Logoi serve as a reason for Christians to impel themselves to stronger faith in God, which should lead to a greater commitment on their behalf to spiritual struggle. The contemplation of the Logoi is not the pinnacle of the spiritual life, but rather it is an extremely important step on the path towards union with God. Philokalia II 122. For Maximus, the deep reflection on the inner principles is immediately below the spiritual level that is characterized by someone who focuses all of their spiritual cogitation on God alone, and no longer on His creation or the Logoi thereof. Just as there are multiple levels of spiritual life above illumination, there are also ones preceding illumination. Maximus believes the Christian must pass through the beginning stages of spiritual life before he can delve into the understanding of the inner essences. Dispassion is the precondition for contemplation of the Logoi. Philokalia II 105. Once one of God's elect has ceased acting on the passions, Christ comes to dwell in him. Philokalia II 110. The Holy Spirit then teaches him about the inner essences. In his 91st text from the 4th century of various texts, Saint Maximus explains the change occurring to the illumined Christian as he begins to contemplate the Logoi. The grace of God stamps the sensory organs of the dispassionate one with spiritual discernment. Philokalia II 258. From this change the Christian is then able to see the material world in light of spiritual realities, and thus no longer is deceived by it. This divinely given discretion is a vital characteristic of contemplating the Logoi. Perceiving the inner essences of created beings requires discretion, and the willingness to see past sensory deceptions. Maximus repeatedly stresses this point throughout his writing. A man who wants to investigate the inner essences of created beings must remove himself from the image of sensible appearances. Philokalia II 186. Maximus indicates that it is a tactic of the devil to manipulate man away from contemplating the Logoi to debased contemplation of sensible characteristics of material objects. Philokalia II 251. We recognize here, and in the writings of Evagrius and Hesychios of Sinai on prayer, that a common trait of accomplished spiritual strugglers is their conquering of mental images, and vigilance over sensory intake. Maximus seems to use parts of Plato and parts of Aristotle in constructing his theory of knowledge, yet takes his theory to a new theological understanding in light of his Christian beliefs. On the one hand, he uses Plato's emphasis on remembering old experiences in emphasizing the importance of commemorating continually the various moments in Christ's life. On the other hand, he uses Aristotle's focus on inner essences being somewhat determinable by the properties of a substance.